This is an introduction to the scientific method. What is the scientific method? The scientific method is a thought process used by scientists to ask and answer questions and solve problems. Scientists use it to make a claim, which is an answer to the question or problem, using evidence, using data analysis from an experiment, and that supports their reasoning or their scientific explanations. Here are all of these steps. You first need to identify a problem or ask a question. Next, you form a hypothesis, a possible explanation to the question or the problem. Then you design an experiment, collect and analyze data, write a conclusion, and then repeat. We always need to repeat experiments to make sure we get the same results every time. The one thing I want to clarify about the scientific method is although there are a series of steps that are generally followed, it doesn't always have to be a nice step-by-step process every time. It's not like you reach the last step and you are done. Science is a continuous process. Based on your experiment and your data, you might get evidence that supports your hypothesis. But you might start asking other questions, and your experiment might want to be repeated or tweaked by other scientists. So they're going to generate hypotheses and repeat this cycle. You might get unexpected data, and in that case, you have to go back to the drawing board and create a new hypothesis and a new experiment. So the scientific method is more of a cycle than a series of single steps. After you identify a problem or ask a question, the next step is to generate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an educated guess or a prediction as to what the results of your experiment would be. The best hypotheses are written as if, then, because statements. And so I have some examples of what I mean by this. If I feed this brand of dog food to my dog, then she will gain weight because there's a lot of fat in the food. Or if I give fertilizer to a plant, then it will grow taller because the fertilizer has nutrients. The if, then, because statements identify what you are changing in the experiment, what you are measuring, and your reasoning for why you expect those to be your results. After you form your hypothesis, you need to design an experiment. Experiments test a variable, and variables are changes that you make in the experiment. And there are two types of variables in each experiment. The first is what you change. You will do something in order to cause a change in the results of the experiment. This is called the independent variable, or you might have heard manipulated variable. You can think of this as cause and effect, since you will cause a change in an experiment and it will have an effect on your results. The effect is the dependent variable, and this is what you measure. This is the other reason why we need to write if, then, because statements for our hypotheses, because using that format lets us identify both the independent and dependent variables that are in our experiment. So if we take this first example, if I feed this brand of dog food to my dog, then she will gain weight because there is a lot of fat in the food. What I changed was the type of dog food that I fed to my dog. And what I am measuring is the change in her weight. The cause is the new food, and the effect is the weight gain. The cause is the independent variable. The effect is the dependent variable. If you look at the second example, if I give fertilizer to a plant, then it will grow taller because the fertilizer has nutrients. The independent variable is the fertilizer because this is what I did differently to the plant. It's what I changed about the plant's environment. The dependent variable is the plant's height, how tall it will grow. The fertilizer was the cause. The effect was the height, the change in height, or the difference in height compared to a different fertilizer. Experiments will test an independent variable. Good experiments have at least two groups, a control group and an experimental group. The control group is the group without the independent variable, and the experimental group is with the independent variable. If we look at the dog food example, this would be how you would set up an experiment with both a control group and an experimental group. We would start by feeding my dog her normal food, the typical brand of food that I buy her, for about a week. And I would measure her weight after that week. Then I would change her food. And I would see after a week later how much weight she gains, if she gained at all. But we have 1 week with the old food and 1 week with the new food. We need to make sure we have a control group in order to compare. Because if I just started feeding her new food without measuring how the old food affected her weight, I wouldn't know if the new food actually had an effect on her weight. This example, I'm going to have you try to identify the control group, experimental group, independent and dependent variables on your own. So the experiment is, Sally wondered if a new fertilizer would help her tomato plants grow better than the one she usually buys. She decided to grow 2 plants. She gave one plant the old fertilizer and the other the new fertilizer. After 1 week, she measured the height of the plants. Take a minute and answer each of the questions as they pop up on Edpuzzle. Good experiments also have constants. These are factors that are kept the same between both experimental and control groups. If you don't keep any constants, you cannot make a conclusion. So if we were to look at the dog example again, I would have to keep constant how often I feed her, how often I walk her, and how much food I feed her when I give her the new food. I'd have it to keep it the same as I would as I was giving her the old food. If I were to give her new food and fed her 5 times a day, I couldn't tell if it was the new food that caused her to gain weight or because I ended up giving her more food. If I walked her less when I had the old food and started taking her on more walks when I was giving her the new food, and she gained weight. I couldn't tell if it was because she was getting more exercise or if it was because of the new food. What are some things that you think would need to be kept constant in this example? So Sally chose a new fertilizer and she thought that it would affect the height of tomato plants. So, what are some things that you think would need to be kept constant between the plant with the old fertilizer and the plant with the new fertilizer? What are some things that need to be kept the same? After you do an experiment, you need to collect data and then analyze the data. You make your measurements and then you look closely at the data. An analysis can include things like calculations, such as averages or slopes, graphing, and comparing the control and experimental groups. You might also find trends and patterns in the data. And finally, our conclusions. Scientists are going to report their findings, and they use a claim evidence reasoning in order to do that. And we will have practice writing claim evidence reasoning lab analyses throughout the year. The claim basically answers the question, was the hypothesis correct? Evidence cites the data that leads you to this conclusion, and then reasoning explains the science behind the results. And it explains why you got the results that you did. It's also during that conclusion stage that you might pose new questions that create more hypotheses that starts this whole process over again.